We're going to take you straight to Moscow and listen in to President Putin addressing the events overnight. Let's listen in.
Russia is engaged in the fiercest fight for its future, repelling aggression. Practically, the entire military information and information might of the West has been sent against us. We're fighting for our independence, for our right to remain Russia, a country with 1,000 years of thousands of years of history. Today, the fate of our people is being decided. We need the consolidation of all forces. Everything has to be discarded that weakens us. Anything that can be used and is being used to subvert us from within. And therefore, any actions that split us is a betrayal of your people, betrayal of the comrades that are fighting on the front line, a knife in the back of our people. And this was struck Russia in 1917, when Russia was waging the First World War, when victory was stolen from it. Politicking behind the back of the army and the people turned into a huge upheaval, the destruction of the army and the state, the loss of huge territories. As a result, was tragedy, Russians killing Russians, civil war, and benefit was derived by various political adventurers, foreign powers that are tearing the country apart. We shall not let this happen again. We will defend our people and our state, including against internal strife and betrayal. And that's what we're facing, betrayal. And when personal ambitions take over faith in your own people and the cause for which the soldiers of the Wagner group are fighting shoulder to shoulder, those who liberated Soledar and Artemovsk, the villages and towns of Donbass. They fought and gave their lives for Novorossiya, New Russia, giving their lives. And this is the betrayal by those who are pushing the country to anarchy and fratricide, defeat, ultimately, and capitulation. I shall repeat, any internal mutiny is a serious threat to our state, our nation. It is a blow to Russia, a blow to our people, and our actions to defend the state against this threat will be harsh. Those who consciously chose treason, blackmail, and terrorist methods will be inevitably punished. They will answer before the law and before our people. The armed forces and other state authorities have received the necessary orders. Additional measures of an anti-terrorist nature are now in force in Moscow region and other regions. Resolute action will be taken to stabilize the situation in Rostov-on-Don. It remains difficult. In fact, this government and military administrations have been blocked. As the President of Russia and the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, as a citizen of Russia, I shall do everything to defend the country, to defend the constitutional system, life and security and the freedom of people, those who organized and prepared the armed mutiny, those who took up arms against their comrades, have betrayed Russia and will answer for it. Those who are being drawn into this crime, I urge them not to make this irrevocable mistake and stop taking part in the crime. I am sure that we will preserve and defend everything that is sacred to us, and together with our motherland, we will overcome any trials and will be even stronger.
So that is President Putin there that we just heard from addressing the nation after this, of course, a dramatic event. We had Yevgeny Prigozhin throwing down a challenge to the Russian military, and we heard President Putin there saying we are fighting for our right to remain as a sovereign nation in Russia. He said any action that divides Russia is betrayal. Betrayal is a word he used several times. He also said that those who were engaging in this were betraying the very soldiers, the Wagner fighters who had given their lives for a new Russia. He talked about personal ambitions taking over and the fact that any internal mutiny was a blow to Russia. He said that. He also talked about the response. He said our actions will be harsh. Those who have chosen treason, terrorism and blackmail will be punished. He mentioned that armed forces have been mobilized as well as additional anti-terrorist measures taken, particularly to take back control of some of those areas, including Rostov-on-Don. So attempts going on there to restore order. That's what we've heard from President Putin there. Well, we have, of course, been following this story since this serious escalation of infighting between Russia's Wagner mercenary group and the Russian military began. Tanks and armored vehicles have taken up positions in the southern Russian city of Rostov-on-Don as that dispute between the army and the Wagner mercenary group threatens to degenerate into fighting. Now, there have been videos on social media showing heavily armed men in uniform around a government building. The Wagner boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, released video of himself inside the local military headquarters in Rostov, which is one of the areas that President Putin was mentioning. He says that all military installations in the city are under control and working normally. That's according to Yevgeny Prigozhin. Well, earlier, the Kremlin ordered the arrest of Prigozhin, whose men have been fighting alongside Russian forces in Ukraine after he accused the Russian military of carrying out a deadly missile strike on Wagner troops in Ukraine. That's something that the Defense Ministry denies. And as we heard as well from President Putin, anti-terror measures have been introduced in Moscow with armored vehicles seen on the streets. And the M4 highway connecting Moscow and Rostov has been closed. Well, Prigozhin announced what he called a march for justice, saying that anyone who stood in his way would be eliminated. But he says that this is not a coup.
They've been shooting at us, we've been shooting at them. And that has been going on these 8 long years. From 2014 to 2022. Sometimes the amount of shelling and exchange of fire has increased, and sometimes it is eased. On February 24th, there was nothing extraordinary. Now the Russian Defense Ministry is trying to deceive the president and the public by claiming there was insane aggression on the part of Ukraine, and they were going to attack us, along with the entire NATO bloc. So the so-called special military operation on February 24th was launched for completely different reasons.
So a reminder there of what has been happening. Prigozhin has vowed to go all the way and topple the Russian military leadership, but he denied that he was carrying out a coup. Russian state TV's Channel 1 interrupted regular programming to broadcast an emergency news bulletin recapping official statements about Prigozhin and Wagner and stating that President Putin was being kept informed of developments. Well, Russian General Vladimir Alexeyev described Mr. Prigozhin's actions as madness, whilst the deputy commander of the Russian-Ukraine campaign, Sergei Surovikin, told Wagner soldiers to stand down.
You must do this before it is too late. Obey the will and the command of the elected president of the Russian Federation. Stop the convoys, return to bases and places where you were stationed.
A lot has been happening, but let's go live now and talk about some of this with Colonel Brendan Kearney, former Chief of Staff for the U.S. Marine Corps Forces in Europe. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been an extraordinary morning with all these developments. If you were listening into what President Putin was saying there, I wonder if we could get your thoughts on his response.
Well, Nancy, it really is extraordinary. I mean, you're catching me on the American victory, sailing through the archipelago of Alaska. And I'm astonished, to be honest with you. I've been following Prigozhin for a while, and he is truly a character in the finest sense of the word. But we're seeing a potential here of Russia imploding with a civil war, and we don't want that. No one wants it, and maybe that will be avoided. But this is really a really interesting historical time for Russia, and all we can hope is the best for the Russian and the Ukrainian people.
Do you really think that it could go that far? I mean, you're talking about the possibility of Russia imploding into civil war. We have noticed, though, that so far it seems that Prigozhin is stopping just short of attacking President Putin himself and saying that his problems are with military officials.
It's an interesting relationship that is seemingly going on. And we've watched this now for 7, 8, 9 months with Prigozhin in his group. I'm not really sure anybody really knows in the West what exactly the relationship is. But Prigozhin is constantly going after the most senior levels of the Russian military, really avoiding criticizing Putin himself. But this is there's a dance going on here that I'm not sure any of us really know what the music is that's playing it. So I'm astonished in many respects that Prigozhin is doing this early on, after his engagement here in Western Ukraine. But this is a strange time. But I guess if you look back to 1917 and 1918 in Russia, it was a strange time then.
And the way you've put it, there's a dance going on here. We're not sure what the music is. I think that's quite apt. This seems to have taken most people by surprise. Does it suggest to you that we actually know less than we think we do about what's really going on in Russia, what's really going on within the military, what's really going on between President Putin and the Wagner Group?
Nancy, I've been involved in studying Russia for roughly 50 years. And I have friends, I knew friends, they've since passed on, that were involved in Russia in the 1920s and the 1930s. And I'll tell you with great confidence, no one knows what's going on in Russia. It is an extraordinarily complex, wonderful country that is nowhere near Europe, nowhere near Asia. If we want to figure out what's going on in Russia, good luck.
We just have to wait and see what happens. But with the war going on in Ukraine, how do you think that will be affected by everything that's happening internally in Russia? Have we lost you, Brendan? I hope you're still with us. Unfortunately, it looks like his voyage has cut us short. Colonel Brendan Kearney there. This was a really enlightening conversation. It's a shame that we lost him, but we certainly got some good insights from him. And earlier we did speak to Nina Khrushcheva, a professor of international affairs at the New School in New York. She's also the great-granddaughter of former Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Well, she began by telling us what she has been witnessing on the streets of Moscow.
I went to walk around. I'm off center. I live close to the center, but not in the very center of it. But even on our street that leads towards the center, there are armored vehicles. There are not many soldiers, but different battalions of different kinds. Not that very many, but certainly present, not very many people in the street. I was asked not to take pictures, and a few young men that were passing by were asked for their documents. I was not. So far, and I'm going to go later to do some walkabout and see how it plays around near the Kremlin. But so far, from the pictures that I've seen in social media, even in the state media, there is the closer to the Kremlin, the more armored vehicles and more police and more soldiers are there, and we'll see what Putin will say if he speaks, because there's already been a question, where is Putin? It has been the whole night going on, and where is the president of the Russian Federation himself addressing this issue?
And just to bring in a new line from the Russian Defense Ministry, apparently it has told Wagner fighters, you were deceived and dragged into criminal adventure. As you say, people are waiting to hear what President Putin will say about this. But in the meantime, what are people saying about this? Is there much conversation about what's going on?
There is a lot of conversation. I mean, we started at 6 or 5 in the morning exchanging phone calls, trying to figure out. And there's a lot of scenarios, as you know. I mean, this whole war has been a lot of scenarios of why and how it's going to end. And so what is the end game for Wagner? What is the end game for Prigozhin? What does he want? In fact, the bit from his address that you played here in Russia is being blocked. You actually cannot hear this. You can only hear his statement or know about his statement that the Russian troops, the military, official military, shelled or attacked the Wagner camp, but not about why the war happened and how Putin was deceived and how everybody else was deceived. And in fact, that part of the corruption and essentially doubting the war altogether has been banned by the Russian procuracy, whatever it is, the Attorney General, right away. So that part is not even part of the discussion. It's only about the shelling. One of the scenarios is that it is staged, maybe even by the Kremlin, to have a very violent but very forceful way to announce the further militarization, the martial law, and so on and so forth. So close the country, start a war, using Prigozhin for those purposes. Another one, and one should not discard it at all, and it has been like that for a year and a half, almost a year and a half since the war began, is that an absolute discombobulation in all forces of government, who bombed whom, who said what, and that's why, in fact, people are very upset still, or are very upset, has been upset over during the night, is that where is Putin? I mean, there is basically military coup is happening, and Putin is silent and kind of allow his flunkies to speak for the state. But basically, one of the scenarios which I found quite convincing is that because Prigozhin has been such a hero because the army wasn't doing well, obviously, and Prigozhin has been such a hero and an honest hero because he was saying things that the army wasn't saying. Like there's a scene from Dr. Strangelove, the film of Stanley Kubrick, 1964, when General Ripper went a little bit funny in his head and basically started shooting off. And so this is another thing that Prigozhin may think that he's invincible because he has been indispensable for the Kremlin in this war, and therefore he can do whatever, even become the next president.
Speaking there to Nina Khrushcheva, professor of international affairs. Of course, that interview just before we heard from President Putin, who then said that this was a betrayal and that those involved would be punished. Why don't we go now to speak to Moscow, to Steve Rosenberg, in Moscow, who is joining us live. Steve, I'm sure this might not be what you expected to be talking about when you woke up this morning. It's surprised all of us, really.
Yeah, well, actually, it began yesterday morning. I was astonished to watch Mr. Prigozhin's video address that was posted online, where he basically accused Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, of being behind the war in Ukraine, blaming him for the war, and saying that the justifications that the Kremlin had given the original justifications, the need to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, remember those back from February 2022, that this wasn't about those at all. He claimed that the Russian defense minister had wanted to be promoted from general to marshal. And at that point, I thought, and other people thought, that perhaps this was a ploy to give Vladimir Putin a way out of this war, which hasn't gone to plan, to make the Russian military leadership the fall guys here for Russian military failures. And then, yesterday evening, even more astonishment, as Mr. Prigozhin claimed that the Russian military, in other words his own side, had launched a missile attack on a Wagner base camp, killing, he said, lots of people, although he provided no evidence of that, and then announcing that the Wagner had taken the decision to start a march of justice. He said it wasn't a military coup, but he said he had 25,000 Wagner fighters who were ready to get rid of evil, he said, in the Russian military leadership. So it was clear last night that he was laying down the gauntlet and this challenge to try to remove the Russian military leadership. And then waking up this morning, the reports that Wagner fighters had crossed over from Ukraine back into Russia, that they had entered Rostov. The reports this morning that Wagner is now in control of military sites in Rostov, including the airfield, including, it seems, from another video, the major regional military headquarters in Rostov. There was this extraordinary video that we saw this morning, again posted on social media, showing Yevgeny Prigozhin sitting between two very senior Russian military commanders, including a deputy defense minister, arguing with them, basically delivering an ultimatum to them, saying that, look, I've come here to get the Russian defense minister and the chief of the general staff, and until I do get them, we're going to stay right here, we're going to continue to blockade Rostov, and we will head to Moscow. So quite extraordinary that this Russian mercenary group that was fighting on the side of Russia, Mr. Prigozhin, who had very close links for years to President Putin, has apparently gone rogue now and is determined to topple the Russian military leadership. And although he insists that he's not against the president, this does put a lot of pressure, I think, on Vladimir Putin.
And we have heard from Vladimir Putin. What did you make of his address? He said he was dealing with the crisis. It was a short TV address. He did mention Wagner mercenaries. He didn't mention Prigozhin once.
What do I make of it? This was a tough-talking Vladimir Putin, trying to show to the Russian people that he is a president who remains in control of the situation, a very difficult situation. So we had phrases like, this is a stab in the back. He described Wagner's actions. He said that domestic troubles were a deadly threat to Russia, and he promised a tough response. He called this treachery, and he basically likened the situation now to 1917, the year, of course, of the Russian Revolution. So no sense from that brief TV address that Vladimir Putin is ready, willing, in a mood to sit down and chat to Mr. Prigozhin and kind of work things out, or even give up his defense minister, give up his chief of the general staff. No, this is a president who's basically saying, enough is enough, we're going to crack down now. But how is he going to do that? That's the question. It's a very difficult situation for Vladimir Putin. And of course, you know, there's the situation in Ukraine. 16 months ago, Vladimir Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russia's war in Ukraine has not gone according to plan, so a huge headache there for Vladimir Putin. Meanwhile, he has to sort out a very difficult domestic situation and a very dangerous threat to his power here now.
All right, Steve Rosenberg in Moscow there for us. Thank you very much for your analysis.